Matthew Coller, Jonathan Harrison producing, and now we welcome in. He's always on Fridays. Our friend from ESPN, Myron Medcalf, and Myron, you are in Atlanta right now, but can you feel the tension coming from Egan?
I certainly can. It'll be interesting to see what happens Sunday between the Minnesota Vikings as they're led by new Dallas Cowboys coach Mike Zimmer. It's going to be interesting. Interesting matchup.
Oh, Myron. I mean, okay, it's not super shocking that Jerry Jones would be behind something unique like this, but I can also actually support it if I were in Dallas. I would be saying, well, wait a minute. This is a guy who has had a ton of defensive success. Dallas had really good offensive numbers, and it seems like they have a smart offensive mind, but Kellen Moore is not ready to be a head coach. They kind of need to be whipped into shape a little bit. It makes sense from their end. The big question is just, can the Vikings do anything in New Orleans to have Mike Zimmer continue to be here as the head coach? Because as the week has gone along, Myron, I've felt more and more like this is just a reality. I'm not for it. I haven't thought it's a good idea, but it's a reality. If they get smoked on Sunday, I think this is it.
It feels that way, and I think to me, I think the smartest coaches know you want to leave before you get fired, right? I mean, if you can figure it out, I think that's the best situation. You have some success, and then you leave before they're able to put you out. And this seems perfect to me. Like Collar, I think if the Cowboys really had Urban Meyer or if they had Lincoln Riley, there's no way they would have allowed the Jason Garrett situation to drag out this way because they would have said, we got to go get those guys, bring them on board, and let them reshape the organization. So I think it's clear they don't have one of those guys. Then you're left with who? The recycled former head coaches out there. I mean, who do you call? Mike McCarthy? So I think if you're Jerry Jones, you're looking at your options, your realistic options, and you go, okay, I can get a guy, Mike Zimmer, who knows my personality, who knows the organization, who's had a lot of success on defense, which is where we struggled, which has been the biggest problem here. If he can get a good offensive coordinator, there's no reason to think that Mike Zimmer couldn't be a great solution for the Cowboys. So it feels to me, if your options are go into the 2020 season with everybody knowing that if you can't win in year 3 with Kirk Cousins, you're done, or start somewhere fresh. To me, Cowboys, Mike Zimmer, if they lose Sunday, and especially if it's a bad loss, it makes a lot of sense to me.
It makes a lot of sense from the Cowboys' perspective. Now, from the Vikings' perspective, though, it's a little different because when I tweeted last night that I had the sense this is a real thing, which is kind of the only way I could put it on Twitter, I got a lot of responses that said the Vikings would be absolutely crazy to move on from a head coach who has had this much success. You are in the playoffs for the third time in the last 5 years. I kind of look at 2014 as not really his team yet. And then since then, they have been highly competitive under Mike Zimmer. He's got a winning percentage of 600, and he's got the postseason win against New Orleans. I know it took a miracle, but you got a playoff win there. You've got a trip to the NFC Championship game. And even though it didn't go well, it's not like teams all around the league are just popping up in conference championship games all the time. Your team, every season they've gone into with Zimmer since 2015, has had a chance. And all the things that he's dealt with here, especially at the quarterback position, it's hard not to look at it and say, wait, you're going to find a better coach than this? That's going to be a really tall task, I think.
See, I think that's one way to look at it, Collar. Obviously, 100%. I think a lot of people are viewing it that way. I don't know if that's the right phrasing in my book. To me, the question is, has he reached his ceiling? Has he already done as much as he's going to do in Minnesota? And I think that's a valid question. The stakes changed in 2017, and we say the same thing over and over, I feel like. But 2017 was the year where the Vikings were supposed to go forward and begin to compete for championships, not slide into the playoffs as the number 6 seed on the road against a really good Saints team, not miss the playoffs at 8-7-1 last year in the year 1 of Kirk Cousins. I think it's fair to go, you could get that far with Case Keenum with a lot of the same pieces and a better quarterback. And then here you are. And I think the other problem is the NFC. It was very, very, I won't say it was an easier field, but there's a lot of parity in the NFC. The Green Bay Packers are at home right now resting because they beat the Vikings essentially, right? I don't think they're a great team. They're right there with the Vikings, but they beat Minnesota, and that elevated them to the 2 seed. For a team like Green Bay to have that second bye, that's phenomenal to me. It says a lot about the makeup of the NFC. And if you can't get in a year like this higher than a 6, I think it's fair to go, what changes in 2020 with Mike Zimmer? Like, what is the thing that's going to happen that hasn't already happened? And that's where it's not about you're losing a good coach. It's a time for an outside vision to come in. And I think that's what the Packers saw when they brought in Matt LaFleur. Matt McCarthy had won big. He won a Super Bowl. But was it time for a new culture? They said yes, and I think it's paid off for them to some degree.
Yeah, and I understand that side of it for sure, that messages get stale and people reach their peak and there's not much more they can do. And eventually, as the owners of the team, I'm sure that they get tired of getting in their private jet in New Jersey and flying up to Minnesota and showing up at US Bank Stadium and watching incredible pregame ceremonies and shooting off fireworks. Unfortunately, the Dragon doesn't, it doesn't breathe fire anymore, which is just terrible. Thanks,
Colts
Titans.
messed that up, right? Was the Colts messed it up?
It was the Titans. They lit a speaker on fire or something, and then everybody couldn't use fire anymore, which is a joke. So NFL, fix that before next year. This is much more important to me than all this other stuff, Myron. But you get there and you look at it. You own this team, and you look at this stadium, and you look at the players that you have down there, and the All Pros and the Pro Bowlers and everything else, and you look at what you've built here, and you go, well, we should win one of these damn big games eventually, right? Like 2 seasons in a row with all the talent on the field, and you have 2 games against winning teams that you've beaten, and it's both times mediocre Philadelphia teams that were just barely over 500. I mean, I understand it from that angle. I just look at somebody different. I don't look at the head coach of the team for that. I look at the quarterback. I look at it as you are so often bringing a knife to a gunfight with whoever the quarterback was, except for Teddy Bridgewater as he was emerging. But even aside from that, a lot of times, I mean, if it was Bridgewater, Rodgers, you're still bringing in the lesser quarterback. And at any point during Case Keenum, at any point during Kirk Cousins, you go into a huge game against a great team, your guy is not as good as their guy at the most important position. It's like, Myron, when the Utah Jazz play against the Los Angeles Lakers in the playoffs later this year, who you picking? Yeah. LeBron. Yeah. Because it's like that. And that's where I get frustrated a little bit. And I ask, has Zimmer done what he's supposed to do here, which is have a top 5 defense, which he did this year in points against? Has he created a culture? Has he kept people around? What's the feeling of players around him is a little bit questionable right now, but players came back like Anthony Barr to play for him. Well, it's really hard for me to say, oh man, get that guy out of here.
I can see that perspective, and I understand the idea of, Kirk Cousins. You can put a lot of the blame on him. You can say, hey, with what he's been given on paper, at least things have gone well, but why is everybody afraid to say the Super Bowl word? Like, say that. Like, at the end of the day, that was the goal. When you go to the NFC Championship with Case Keenum, you're supposed to, the messaging was you're going to compete for a Super Bowl at some point in the coming years. So now you got to ask yourself a question. Year 3 could be the last year under Kirk Cousins, right? And if that's a failure, you got to hit the reset button on everything. Because if you lose him and now you got to go out looking for a quarterback, that could be a long journey. And that's when teams go, you know what? We're going to find some rookie quarterback. We're going to start to build around him, and we're going to start this thing all over again. So I think you have to ask yourself, do you trust Mike Zimmer in year 3 with the same opportunity? And that's up to Spielman, at least for now, and the ownership. But it wouldn't surprise me if you had folks in the front office who said, yeah, what's the harm in maybe bringing in a new voice, especially if it's a perfect scenario where Mike Zimmer wants to go to Dallas and they bring in someone else, and I don't know who that person is, but it could work out for everyone. I just think you risk, if next year is a failure, you got to hit the button on the whole franchise and start over because you failed in the 3 years you had Kirk Cousins where you were supposed to be competitive and compete for Super Bowls. You weren't supposed to be a 6 seed, barely getting into the playoffs in a dangerous matchup. You were supposed to be hosting at US Bank Stadium. You were supposed to be the team that everybody was chasing, and you're not. So how many times do we say next year? Folks are tired of saying next year, Coller.
Yeah.
At some point, you got to say this is what it is.
Yeah. And I guess I just look at when you signed Kirk Cousins, you put a ceiling on what you could do. I mean, I think he's been really good this year. He's had the best year of his career statistically, and there are some games where I sat back and watched like, whoa, man, he is really slinging it today. The Philadelphia game's a great example. Detroit game, he's just on fire. They fit the offense to him. The weapons are playing really well, and he's a good quarterback. But when you think about the fundamental flaws of the guy that you signed, it's really difficult to see him competing with some of the better quarterbacks in the NFL. And that's kind of what you signed yourself up for. And quarterbacks like this, Myron, they get coaches fired every time. I mean, Marvin Lewis.
But he promoted him though, Coller, right? He wanted him. I mean, like Zimmer's the one.
I don't think so.
KC
I don't think Zimmer wanted Kirk Cousins, but I think it was the only option that they really had, considering the fear of Teddy Bridgewater's knee. I mean, I think that ownership looked at it and said, we'll spend the money. So they said, well, okay, well, we don't trust Sam's knee. We don't trust Teddy's knee. We don't trust Case to be the same guy. And what are our other options? Now, of course, I am the person who wanted to draft Lamar Jackson. I'm just going to throw that out there. But I can understand not wanting to draft Lamar Jackson either and hoping to put the Super Bowl back, on a rookie or something like that. So they bring in Kirk Cousins, and I get it, but it's just being realistic as ownership and fans of what you got yourself into with a quarterback who had consistently not found ways to win because he's not Drew Brees. He's Matt Stafford. He's Jay Cutler. He's Alex Smith. He's more in that ballpark of guys who are just good enough to get you to the playoffs and not usually good enough to get you any farther. And if he wants to prove me wrong, he definitely can on Sunday.
Well, so how long do you wait till you get that guy there? You give him another 5 years, 10 years? Here's my problem with what you just said, right? It's so easy to absolve a coach of any responsibility when things go south. And it's much easier to praise them when things go right. But that's not the way the world works, right? If you are the head of a major corporation, right? Let's say you run Toyota or something like that, or some major auto manufacturer, and there's a recall on your car. What happens every single time in that press conference? Someone who's a CEO or a COO at a major company, he says, look, I'm resigning. He wasn't working in the factory installing these things, but guess what? He's the face of that company, and he has to assume responsibility. And Mike Zimmer has to as well. What did he say? He wanted Kirk Cousins or he didn't. At the end of the day, he said Case Keenum wasn't good enough. And he said that Kirk Cousins was an upgrade. Whether it was the ideal upgrade, he said this guy was an upgrade, and this is how we're going to compete for championships. That hasn't happened. He's also a guy who has mismanaged games as well. There have been moments where you said, okay, what is happening in the first half of a Packers game at home where you have 3 opportunities to convert turnovers into bigger plays and you can't do it? Like, what is going on there? That's a game you got to win. Why can't you beat Kansas City when Matt Moore is the quarterback? That, to me, is an overall collective thing, and the head of all that is Mike Zimmer.
Yep.
So I can't say this guy, hasn't had the right quarterback, and that's the excuse every single time. It's his show. It's his operation. He has to assume some blame. He has not gotten the job done. And if they lose on Sunday, this will be a continued failure for Mike Zimmer and the Vikings under Kirk Cousins.
Yeah, and you're right about that they had plenty of opportunities in Chicago against the Bears team that didn't turn out to be very good. Both games against Green Bay, the game against Kansas City. In the NFC this year, with as many awful teams as there was a shot to have a first-round bye for this team, and they have the talent to do it, and they did not succeed. But that's the funny thing about how we look at everything is, the Wilfs apparently love Kevin Stefanski, but what's been the real cause of most of these losses is offensive no-shows. But I went back and looked at the tape, and that game against Green Bay, I see a quarterback who had all sorts of opportunities to make something happen and to win you a game, and it didn't. And that's where it always comes back to me. But I get where you're coming from. Eventually, when you have a coach for so long and it doesn't work, you have to say, well, we got to try something else because this is the last year of Kirk's contract. And if they still haven't decided yet what they're going to do with an extension, I mean, first of all, I think you should probably have a really good sense by now. You shouldn't be judging it on one playoff game, but that's kind of how the NFL tends to work with owners. So if you see them not be able to get it done again in the playoffs, I understand saying, well, okay, this is just the ceiling for what we are. But I also caution that a little bit and say, the Detroit Lions decided that, Jim Caldwell had done all he could do. Sorry, you got an 11-5 season, a couple 9-7s. We got to get rid of you, man. I mean, we just got to try something else. It's not working. You're an offensive coach. We need a defensive coach. And then Matt Patricia comes in and tanks the franchise 2 years in a row. And we see that all the time where, even with the Bears, Lovie Smith, he just can't get it done and we got to get rid of him and we got to bring in this other guy. I think it was Mark Trestman, and that ends up being a disaster. So, it's a very, very difficult dance, Myron, to decide when you should move on, when you should keep someone. But here's where I'll agree with you is that, the scoreboard is what matters the most. And the scoreboard on 2 years of Kirk Cousins, if it's 0 playoff wins, that isn't good enough. I put my expectation, Myron, at, I think they could get back to an NFC championship within these 2 or 3 years of Kirk Cousins. If you come nowhere close to that in the first 2 years, then I get it.
Yeah. I mean, Sunday matters a lot, clearly. It certainly matters for Kirk Cousins, but I feel like the narrative about Kirk Cousins has already been written. I mean, if he comes in and does what's expected, they'll lose, and we'll have more questions about his future, and we'll go into 2020 going, this is probably it. I don't know that we're going to see a miracle from Kirk Cousins in year 3. But I do think Mike Zimmer, in some ways, has been able to go to the podium and say, it was him. No, actually, it was him this time. No, this guy. No, this has to be better. And I feel like at some point, you've got to go, okay, but you're the guy over the whole operation. Why isn't it better? And how many times do you have to ask that question? I think you can be a good coach in the NFL, but not necessarily the right coach. Mm-hmm. And I think that, to me, is the question you have to consider in the offseason. Is it possible that Mike Zimmer is a good coach, but for what this team wants to achieve and how they want to advance, Coller, he might not be the right coach right now because of the chances they've given him to elevate this team, and it hasn't worked. I think Mike McCarthy was a good coach. I think he's a solid coach, and he's going to get a job probably at some point in the next 2 years if he wants one. But I understand the Packers saying, for the way the NFL is changing and what Aaron Rodgers wants and trying to get the most out of his final years in the league, let's maybe go for a change. So I think the Vikings have to be willing to ask that question and be comfortable with whatever the answer is, because if you move on from Mike Zimmer, it doesn't mean he wasn't a good coach. It just might mean at some point you run out of chances. And at some point you got to make change. And we know all the failures that happen when people change coaches, but that shouldn't stop you from making a move and taking that risk.
Okay, Myron. Well, let me ask you this before I let you go and get to whatever job you're doing this week, covering college basketball for ESPN. What if they win? I mean, how weird is that? I still wouldn't expect that they could get to the NFC Championship and get through San Francisco, or definitely not to the Super Bowl still with the road they're having to travel, that nobody's done it since 2010, and that was Aaron at his absolute best. But I mean, if they win, I'm gonna write this for tomorrow, that everyone's gonna be looking around, and I'll ruin for people who read ScoreNorth.com. I'll ruin the lead to my story because I care so much about you here on Purple Daily. Is I was watching Twilight Zone the other day. They have the marathon at the start of every year, and there's an episode where everybody in the town thinks that a bomb is going to hit their town and they're all going to die, and then one family has a bomb shelter. So all the other neighbors throw that family out of the bomb shelter and they jump in there and they're like, okay, screw you guys or whatever. And then there's no bomb. And they all walk out of the bomb shelter that they stole away from their neighbor. And they're like, all right, well, just back to business there. I think that if they win, we're all going to look around and be like, so all that talk about firing you, I mean, I wasn't behind that. I mean, right, Kirk? Like, I never said you couldn't come through, Kirk. I never thought that for a minute. That was Cam Jordan. That wasn't anyone in our locker room.
Yeah, I think if they win, I'll say I knew they had it in them the whole time. I'll probably be one of those guys. No, I mean, but at the same time, it's okay to do that. Like, because if a team gives you every reason to doubt, and then they surprise you, that's cool. Okay, great. You surprise us, but you don't get to go back and play everyone doubted us. There were reasons to doubt you. You had one win against a winning team,
right?
And that winning team is barely a winning team. So if they surprise everyone, that will be a shocker, and it will be impressive, and it will make it harder to some of those 50-50 questions. Will go in Kirk Cousins' favor. Will go in Mike Zimmer's favor if you can beat a team like the Saints, because I think a lot of people think the Saints can win it all, and not just win it all this year. I think a lot of people think there are certainly scenarios where the Saints have won 3 championships in the last 3 years, if you include this year, and they win it. 2017, the Minneapolis Miracle. They go on to Philly. I think they have a chance to win that game. And then last year's notorious pass interference call. They definitely have a chance if they advance and face New England. So you beat a team like the Saints, that would certainly shape the narrative and change things. But let's everybody slow down and let's see what